In Elhorn Hollow, secrets didn't stay buried. They festered. And the town's biggest, ugliest secret had a name: Marin Holt. Snow was falling, thick and quiet, like the whole world was holding its breath. Every flake that landed on the muddy street seemed to whisper the same thing: hush. This was a town built on hushing things up. The porches creaked with the weight of unspoken words. The church bell stayed silent out of respect for a preacher's long-dead wife. And the windows had eyes. Eyes that saw everything and said nothing. Marin Holt walked right through the middle of all that silence. One boot dragged a little, a tiny hesitation in the snow. Her shawl was pulled tight, not against the cold, but against the stairs. Underneath that thick gray wool, her skin was a road map of a husband's rage. But the map didn't need to be seen. They all knew the geography of it. They saw it in the slight swell of her cheek, the way she flinched when the wind hit her ribs. The women of Elhorn Hollow were experts at reading these signs from their windows. They'd see, purse their lips, and turn back to their own clean, quiet lives. Silence was a currency here. It bought you peace. It kept the trouble next door from becoming trouble in your own house. The butcher's boy, sweeping slush off the steps, looked up as she passed. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second before he looked away, his face burning with a shame that wasn't his. From her window, Miss Hollis Creed watched, her fingers whirring the little wooden cross at her throat. "Too soft for a man like Jeb Holt," she'd whisper to the empty room. "Some women, they just invite sorrow in for supper." Marin didn't hear the words, but she felt them. In a town this small, a whispered judgment hit you with the force of a thrown rock. She made it to the general store, the little bell above the door barely making a sound. The warmth inside felt wrong, like a memory from a different life. Mr. Thacker, a man whose face seemed permanently carved into a look of quiet apology, stood behind the counter. He didn't smile. He just gave one sharp nod, the kind of nod you give when you're acknowledging a coffin being lowered into the ground. "I need flour," Marin said, her voice a dry rasp. "Heard you might," Thacker muttered, not meeting her gaze. She opened her palm on the worn wooden counter. 2 coins, small and cold. "And bandages." The silence stretched. 2 coins wasn't enough for both. It was a choice between bread and healing. In Elhorn Hollow, that was a choice most women had to make sooner or later. Thacker looked at the coins, then at the faint purple shadow under her eye. He hesitated, his jaw working. Then, with a sigh that seemed to pull all the warmth out of the room, he slid a roll of clean white bandages across the counter. "You'll want those more, I reckon," he said, his voice low. He pushed her coins back toward her. "The flour's on the house. Bad batch. Can't sell it." They both knew it was a lie. It was the best flour in the county. It was an act of kindness so small and so dangerous it felt like treason. She nodded, her lips pressed into a tight line, and scooped up the bandages. As she turned to leave, a wall of a man stepped into the doorway, blocking the light. He wore a coat made from the pelt of a bear, and his beard was full of frost. He smelled of pine trees and campfire smoke, a smell so wild and clean it didn't belong in this town of stale secrets. He didn't move. He didn't apologize for blocking her way. He didn't have to. This was Boaz Danner, the man from the ridge. Most folks in town talked about Boaz like he was a ghost story, something to scare children with. He came down from his mountain maybe twice a year, moved through the streets like a shadow, and left without a word. They said he'd once been a preacher who lost his faith. They said he'd killed his own brother over a piece of land. All anyone really knew for sure was that he was dangerous in a way that didn't need proving. The danger was in his silence, in the way he looked at the world as if he'd already seen it end. His eyes, dark and deep-set, landed on Maureen. It wasn't the way Jeb looked at her, all hunger and teeth. It was something else, quieter. It was a look of recognition, the way a man might look at a tree in the dead of winter and still know that, come spring, it would find a way to blossom. The moment lasted only a breath. Then he stepped aside. Marin hurried past him, out into the biting wind, the clean bandages clutched in her hand like a prayer. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. But as she walked away, Mr. Thacker saw Boaz Danner do something no one in Elhorn Hollow had ever seen him do before. He watched her go. And on his face, beneath the wild beard and the winter frost, was a look of cold, calculating fury. He knew the look of a trapped animal. And he knew the look of the men who set the traps. The ranch wasn't a home, it was a cage held together by rotting boards and spite, a place built by hands that knew how to break things far better than they knew how to build them. As Marin pushed open the creaking door, the smell hit her first. Stale whiskey, sweat, and the sour tang of rage that never quite went away. Ezek sat by the hearth, one boot up on the table. He was Jeb's younger brother, which somehow made him meaner. He had all of Jeb's cruelty, but none of his cunning. Ezek was a coward, the kind who only finds his courage when he's standing over someone smaller. "Well, look who finally crawled back," he slurred, a grin splitting his face. "Thought maybe you'd finally done us a favor and froze to death out there." Marin said nothing. She walked past him, her eyes on the floor, and set the precious bandages on the table. Her silence was a wall she built around herself every day, brick by painful brick. "You ain't even gonna thank Jeb for not throwing you to the coyotes yet?" Ezek called after her, his voice dripping with venom. "You're a thankless thing, a stray dog he was dumb enough to take in." She moved toward the stove, her hands shaking as she reached for the matchbox. She just needed to make the fire. If she could make the fire, she could make dinner. If she could make dinner, maybe Jeb would be quiet tonight. It was a desperate, fragile hope, but it was all she had. The match scraped. The tiny flame trembled in her fingers. Then footsteps behind her. Too close. She flinched, her whole body tensing for the blow. His hand clamped down on her shoulder, spinning her around. His grip was like iron. "Don't you turn your back on me," he hissed, his breath hot and sour with whiskey. "Think you're too good to speak now? Too good for the Holts?" "I wasn't," she started to say, the words catching in her throat. The slap was so fast she didn't see it coming. It was a crack of sound that echoed in the small cabin. Her head snapped back, and she staggered, hitting the side of the hot stove. The kettle crashed to the floor with a deafening clang. Pain exploded in her side, sharp and blinding. Ezek stepped closer, his eyes glazed over with that familiar, ugly light. "Don't," she whispered, the word barely audible. But men like Ezek don't listen. Cruelty has its own rhythm, a terrible pulsing beat, and they can't stand it when that beat is broken. He had already made up his mind. He was going to teach her a lesson. Again. Later, after the world had gone dark and silent again, Marin huddled in the corner of the barn. She was hidden behind a stack of hay bales, her arms wrapped around her ribs. Each breath was a fresh stab of pain. It felt like splintered glass was floating inside her chest. Her lip was split open, and one of her eyes was already swelling shut. But she didn't cry. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. It was a sound they liked too much. Instead, she listened. She listened to the wind whistling through the cracks in the barn walls. She listened to the soft snuffling of the horses in their stalls. And she listened to the ghost that whispered in her own blood, a voice that had been silent for years but was now starting to stir. Somewhere out in the darkness, a lone owl hooted, a sharp, mournful sound. And just outside of town, leaning against an old boundary post by the church graveyard, Boaz Danner stood in the falling snow. He hadn't meant to stay, but the image of Marin Holt, the silent acceptance of her fate, had settled in his gut like a shard of glass. He'd seen that look before. Years ago, he'd found a hawk with a broken wing. The bird hadn't made a sound, but its eyes had burned with a fire that refused to be extinguished. Marin's eyes had that same fire, a tiny banked ember, buried deep under layers of ash and pain. But it was there, alive. He knew what men like Jeb and Ezek Holt did to things that were alive. They snuffed them out. Slowly, he turned his gaze from the lights of the town up toward the dark, imposing ridge of the mountain. His mountain, a place where the only law was survival. He knew she wouldn't last another winter in that house. Nobody could. A storm was coming, a storm of blood and bone, and it was going to break her. Or maybe, just maybe, it was going to set her free. He pulled his collar up against the wind and started the long walk back up the ridge. He had work to do, because something told him that woman would be coming his way. Sooner or later, everyone who runs from a monster runs for the mountains, and he would be ready. Marin didn't dream of drowning that night. She dreamed of fire, a wild, cleansing fire that licked at the foundations of the rotten ranch, turning the wood to ash and the secrets to smoke. She woke with a gasp, the taste of blood in her mouth, her body screaming in protest. The hay she was sleeping on was cold and damp. Outside, the wind howled, a long, mournful sound like a mother weeping for a child she couldn't protect. She couldn't stay here. The barn wasn't safe. Nowhere on this property was safe. With a grunt of pain, she pushed herself to her feet. Every muscle screamed. She had to leave. Not in the morning. Not when the snow stopped. Now. She fumbled in the pocket of her dress, her fingers closing around the roll of bandages Mr. Thacker had given her. But there was something else in there too, something small and hard. She pulled it out. It was a little tin box, the kind that holds matches. But it wasn't matches inside. Tucked into a bed of cotton was a tiny folded piece of paper, a map, and a single tarnished brass key. Mr. Thacker hadn't just given her bandages. He'd given her an escape route. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the map. It was a crude drawing of the area north of town, showing a path that wound deep into the woods, up toward the base of the mountain ridge. A small X was marked next to a drawing of what looked like an old abandoned trapper's cabin. He had a plan for her. Someone in this town of silent watchers had decided to do something. Hope, fierce and terrifying, surged through her. It hurt almost as much as her ribs. She had to go. She crept out of the barn, a ghost moving through the swirling snow. The wind covered the sound of her footsteps. The house was dark and silent. Jeb hadn't come home yet, probably still drinking in town. Ezek was passed out by the fire. This was her only chance. She didn't take anything with her. There was nothing in that house she wanted to remember. She just took the map, the key, and the burning, desperate need to be anywhere else. The first few miles were a blur of pain and cold. The wind tore at her thin shawl, and her boots, worn through at the soles, were no match for the deepening snow. But she kept moving, focused on the image of that little cabin on the map. A place where she could lock the door. A place where she could be alone. Behind her, Elhorn Hollow disappeared into the storm, a smudge of faint light against a dark sky. She was leaving it all behind. The whispers, the bruises, the polite smiles that hid so much cruelty. She was walking away from the woman they all thought she was. But the mountain had other plans. The snow came down harder, a blinding white curtain that wiped the world away. The wind shrieked, and the path marked on her map vanished under a fresh blanket of white. She was lost, disoriented. The cold was sinking into her bones, a deep, numbing ache that was starting to feel dangerously like peace. Her foot caught on a hidden root, and she went down hard, tumbling into a deep snowdrift. Pain, white-hot and absolute, exploded in her shoulder. She tried to get up, but her body wouldn't obey. Her limbs felt heavy, disconnected. The snow was soft, like a feather bed, pulling her down, whispering to her to just rest for a little while. Her eyelids fluttered. The world was fading to gray. And then, through the howl of the wind, she heard it, boots crunching in the snow. Deliberate, heavy, slow, getting closer. A shadow fell over her, blocking out the last of the gray light. She saw a massive figure kneeling beside her. Rough wool, strong arms, and that smell again. Pine smoke and winter, and something wild that had never been tamed. Boaz Danner. He didn't say a word. He just slid one powerful arm under her shoulders and the other under her knees, lifting her from the snow as if she weighed nothing at all. Her head lolled back, and her eyes opened one last time. She saw his jaw tight and set. She saw the deep frown carved between his brows. And in his eyes she saw not pity, but a familiar, burning anger. The same anger she felt smoldering deep inside herself. Then the world went black. But before she slipped away completely, one thought surfaced through the fog of pain and cold. He hadn't found her by accident. The storm was too thick, the mountain too vast. He had been waiting for her. He had been watching. And that single, terrifying thought was the last thing she knew before the darkness took her completely. She woke to the gentle kiss of heat on her skin. A fire crackled nearby, its warm orange light dancing on rough-hewn wooden walls. Outside, the wind still howled, but it sounded distant now, muted, like a memory of a storm instead of the real thing. She was lying on a bed, a simple cot layered with thick animal furs. A heavy wool blanket was tucked tightly around her, chasing away the last of the bone-deep chill. She took a breath. Her ribs still ached, a dull, throbbing pain, but the sharp, stabbing agony was gone. She slowly, carefully moved her arm. The pain in her shoulder was still there, but it was manageable. Someone had bandaged her wounds. The cloth was clean, the knots neat and efficient. Someone had washed the blood from her face. She blinked, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light. The cabin was small, just one room. A stone hearth dominated one wall. There was a simple wooden table with two chairs, one of which was worn smooth from years of use. A shelf along the back wall held a small, neat stack of books, a worn Bible prominent among them. A rifle, clean and well-oiled, leaned in the corner by the door. And sitting in the chair by the fire, a block of cedar in one hand and a wickedly sharp blade in the other, was Boaz. He wasn't looking at her. His focus was entirely on the wood in his hands, his thumb guiding the blade in long, smooth strokes. Wood shavings curled off the edge of the blade and fell silently to the floor. His bare pelt coat hung from a peg by the door, heavy and damp with melted snow. Marin tried to speak, to ask where she was, but her throat was raw, and only a dry croak came out. He stopped carving. Without looking up, he set the block of wood and the knife on the hearth. He still didn't look at her. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep underground. "You're safe." It wasn't a question or a reassurance. It was a statement of fact. She was in his home, on his mountain, and that meant she was safe. He stood, moved to the kettle hanging over the fire, and poured steaming broth into a tin cup. He crossed the small room and handed it to her. His hands were large and calloused, but his movements were surprisingly gentle. She took the cup, her cold fingers brushing against his. The contact sent a jolt through her, not of fear, but of surprise. It was the first time a man had touched her without causing pain in longer than she could remember. The warmth from the cup spread through her hands, up her arms, a welcome invasion. She sipped the broth. It was rich and salty, and it felt like life itself trickling down her throat. "I'm Boaz," he said after a long, quiet moment. He was still looking at the fire, not at her. "Most folks call me Bo. You don't have to call me anything." "Marin," she whispered, the name tasting foreign on her own tongue. It felt like the name of a girl she used to know, a long time ago. He nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "I know." Of course he knew. Everyone in Elhorn Hollow knew her name, but the way he said it felt different. He said it like he knew the woman, not just the story the town told about her. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Boaz never asked her what happened. He never asked where she came from or where she was going. He didn't need to. The story was written all over her in shades of purple and blue. He would leave for hours at a time, returning with firewood or a freshly caught rabbit, his presence filling the small cabin with a sense of solid, unshakable calm. When he was there, he worked with his hands, mending a leather strap, cleaning his rifle with meticulous care, or carving, always carving. Little wooden figures began to appear on the mantelpiece. A wolf, a deer, an owl with wide, knowing eyes. Her body began to heal, slowly, like the land thawing after a long winter. The bruises on her skin faded from angry purple to a sick yellow-green, and then disappeared altogether, as if they had never been. Her ribs still burned when she took a deep breath, but each day, the breath got a little deeper. On the fourth morning, she felt strong enough to stand. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. She swayed, her hand flying out to brace herself against the wall. Before she could fall, Boaz was there, his hand on her elbow, steadying her. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. "I can manage," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "I know," he replied, and let her go. That night she couldn't sleep. The silence of the cabin was different from the silence of Elhorn Hollow. Down there the silence was heavy, full of things unsaid. Up here it was clean, empty, full of possibility. She crept to the door and eased it open just a crack. The cold night air hit her face. The sky was a vast black canvas, littered with so many stars they looked like spilled salt. She leaned against the doorframe, watching her breath plume in the air, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she was hiding. She felt like she was watching, waiting. She turned and saw Boaz sitting at the table, watching her. The firelight cast deep shadows on his face, making it impossible to read his expression. He just looked at her, and she looked back. The silence wasn't awkward, it felt like a conversation. "You live up here all alone?" she finally asked, her voice soft. He nodded. "Why?" He seemed to consider the question for a long time, turning it over in his mind. "Because," he finally said, his voice low and rough, "I'm not fit for other folks." She studied his face, the lines carved around his eyes, the old faded scar that ran from his temple down to his jaw. "You don't seem dangerous." A flicker of something, pain maybe or memory, passed through his eyes. "I didn't say I was." The next morning she found one of his shirts, ripped at the seam, lying on the chair. While he was out, she found a needle and thread in a small wooden box on the shelf and carefully stitched it up. She folded it neatly and left it on his chair. He didn't mention it when he returned, but the following day her torn shawl, the one she'd worn when she fled, was hanging on a peg by the door, the rip mended with small, perfect stitches. Their language became one of gestures. She refilled the wood box by the fire. He left a sprig of wild mint by her water cup. She swept the cabin floor, clearing away the wood shavings and dust. He built a second chair, smaller than his own, and placed it on the other side of the hearth. For her. Down in Elhorn Hollow, the gossip was spreading like a fever. "She's gone," Miss Hollis clucked to the women at the church sewing circle. "Ran off with that mountain brute. What did I tell you? Some women just chase sin." Jeb and Ezek didn't talk about it. They just drank more. Their rage denied its usual outlet, festered, turning inward. They rode through town with eyes like chips of ice, daring anyone to look at them sideways. They hadn't lost a wife. They had lost a piece of property, and their pride, that fragile, ugly thing, demanded they get it back. One evening, Marin found Boaz out back, splitting logs with a steady, powerful rhythm. The axe rose and fell, the sound echoing in the crisp evening air. She walked out, holding a steaming tin cup of coffee. He stopped, embedding the axe in the chopping block, and took the cup from her. Their fingers brushed again. This time, neither of them pulled away. "I never thanked you," she said, her voice quiet. "You don't owe me any thanks." "I know," she said, "but I wanted to." He took a long drink of the coffee, his eyes on the dark line of trees at the edge of the clearing. "You planning on heading back down?" he asked, his voice neutral. She shook her head. The movement was small but absolute. "There's nothing for me to go back to." He finally turned to look at her, his gaze direct and steady. "You don't have to stay here either," he said. "The snow will melt in a few weeks. You'll be strong enough. You can go wherever you want." A knot of fear tightened in her stomach. The thought of being alone again, of having to find her way in a world she no longer knew, was terrifying. She looked at the cabin, at the curl of smoke rising from the chimney, at this quiet, scarred man who had shown her more kindness in a week than she had known in years. "And if I wanted to stay?" The words were barely a whisper, so quiet she wasn't sure she'd said them aloud. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened, a tiny flicker of warmth in the cool gray. "Then," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I'd build another room." Word travels fast in a small town, but bad news travels faster. By the time the first patches of brown earth started to show through the melting snow, everyone in Elhorn Hollow knew. Marin Holt was alive, and she was living with Boaz Danner on the mountain. The story twisted and changed with every telling. In the saloon, men who'd never spoken to Boaz claimed he'd put a spell on her, lured her up the mountain with some kind of devil magic. At the general store, the women whispered that she had seduced him, a broken, desperate woman using the only thing she had left to sink her claws into a man. At the church, Miss Hollis spoke of God's judgment, of prideful women who wander from the path and the savagery that awaits them in the wilderness. No one talked about Jeb Holt's fists. No one mentioned Ezek's cruel laughter. No one wondered why a woman might choose a mountain blizzard over the warmth of her own home. It was easier to make her the villain. It meant they didn't have to look at the real villain sitting in the back pew of the church every Sunday, his knuckles raw and bruised. Jeb said nothing. He just watched, and he waited, and he let the poison build inside him. Up on the ridge, life had found a new rhythm. Marin woke each morning not to the sound of angry footsteps, but to the chirping of birds in the pine trees. She began to explore the small clearing around the cabin, her steps growing stronger each day. She found a small, sheltered patch of land behind the cabin, where the sun hit just right, and she began to turn over the soil with her bare hands, preparing it for a garden. The feel of the cold, damp earth was grounding, real. And Boaz, true to his word, began to build. He felled trees with his axe, stripped the bark, and notched the logs with a skill that was both brutal and precise. He was adding a room to the side of the cabin. He didn't say it was for her, and she didn't ask. But one afternoon she stood in the half-finished frame, the smell of fresh-cut pine filling the air, and she laid her hand on the wood. It felt like a promise. They lived in a world of shared silence, but it was a silence that was full of meaning. When she noticed him limping after a long day of hunting, she gathered herbs she'd found in the woods and made a poultice for his knee, leaving it on the table for him without a word. The next day he returned from the forest and silently placed a small, intricately carved wooden bird on the windowsill by her bed. It was a hawk, its wings spread as if it were about to take flight. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. But spring didn't just bring the thaw. It brought watchers. Twice in 1 week, she saw riders at the base of the ridge. They were pretending to hunt, but they moved clumsily through the woods, their rifles held awkwardly. They were town men. She recognized one of them as Benker, the grocer's son. One afternoon, she saw the glint of sunlight off something metal in the trees. A spyglass. They were being watched. She didn't say anything to Boaz until that evening. He came in, his boots muddy, a deep weariness in his eyes. He knew. "They're watching," she said, her voice flat. "I know," he replied. He poured water from a bucket into a tin basin and began to scrub the grime from his hands, his movements slow and deliberate. "Will they come up here?" He stopped washing his hands and looked at her, his face grim. "They will." "Will you fight them?" she asked, her heart pounding. "If I have to." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "For me?" Boaz looked up, water dripping from his knuckles onto the floor. His eyes were dark and serious. "For what's right." That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the dying embers of the fire, the small wooden hawk clutched in her hand. The wood was smooth and cool against her palm. She didn't feel like that broken, fragile woman anymore. The pain was still there, a ghost that lived deep in her bones. But it had changed. It had hardened into something else, something that felt a lot like strength. She thought of the town below, of the faces that turned away, of the sheriff who had once told her that what happened between a husband and a wife was a domestic matter. She thought of the man she had been forced to marry and the brother who was just as cruel. And then she thought of this quiet, scarred man, this outcast who had asked for nothing from her, but had given her everything. He had given her safety. He had given her peace. He was building her a room. A loud crack of thunder jolted her from her thoughts. A storm was rolling in, fast and violent. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin in a stark, blue-white light. And then another sound, a sound that made the blood freeze in her veins. A knock on the door. Not a knock. A fist, pounding on the wood. "Marin!" Jeb's voice, muffled by the wind and the rain, but unmistakable, full of that old, familiar rage. "You come out here right now. You bring that damn animal out with you." Boaz was already on his feet, his hand reaching for the rifle, leaning against the wall. "Don't open it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I won't," he said, his voice a low growl. Then another voice, higher pitched, slurring. "Ezek. Sheriff's with us, Danner. He says you kidnapped her. Says you're harboring my brother's property." Marin stared at Boaz in horror. "They brought the sheriff." Boaz's face was grim. "You think they'd admit you walked away?" A man's pride is a fragile thing, Marin, especially a Holt's. He didn't grab the rifle. Instead, he pulled on his heavy coat, walked to the door, and held out his hand to her. She looked at his hand, then at his face. His eyes were calm, resolute. He wasn't afraid. And looking at him, she realized that she wasn't either. Not anymore. She took his hand. Together, they opened the door and stepped out into the storm. The wind and rain hit them like a physical blow. In the flickering, chaotic light of a half-dozen torches, she could see them. Jeb stood in front, soaked to the bone, but grinning. It was the smile of a wolf that thinks it has you cornered. Ezek was beside him, holding a rifle with shaking hands. Behind them stood 4 or 5 other men from town, their faces hidden by the rain and the shadows. And standing slightly apart from the group, his face a mask of grim authority, was the town sheriff. "You got 5 seconds, Danner," Jeb shouted over the wind. "You send her back down, or we come and get her, and we burn this little shack of yours to the ground." Boaz didn't even flinch. He just stood there, his hand still holding hers, a mountain of a man against the raging storm. "She's not yours to take." "She's my wife," Jeb screamed, taking a step forward. "The law says so. The sheriff says so." "She was your wife," Marin said, her own voice ringing out, clear and strong, cutting through the howl of the wind. The men stopped. Even Jeb looked surprised. "I belong nowhere that you are, Jeb Holt," she said, her voice rising with every word. "I bled in your barn while this town looked away. I screamed inside your walls while they just prayed louder. You all called me quiet and broken, but you were wrong. I'm not quiet anymore." Jeb's face contorted with fury. He lunged for her. Boaz moved. It wasn't fast. It wasn't flashy. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply stepped between Marin and Jeb, planting himself like an ancient tree, his body a solid, unyielding wall. His eyes, cold and hard as river stones, locked with Jeb's. And in that moment, something passed between them that was older and more powerful than rage. It was a promise. "You lay one hand on her again," Boaz said, his voice so low and quiet it was more terrifying than any shout. "And I will break you. Not fast. I'll do it slow. So slow you'll have time to remember every single time you ever hurt her." Jeb's hand, reaching for Marin, began to tremble. His pride was screaming at him to fight, but his body knew better. He had seen the look in Boaz's eyes. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and was perfectly willing to take everything from someone else. He took a step back. Ezek, seeing his brother falter, lowered his rifle. The other men, the ones who had come along for the sport of it, began to shuffle their feet and look away. The fire had gone out of them. One by one, they dropped their torches into the mud, the flames hissing and dying, plunging the clearing into near darkness. "You'll regret this," Jeb spat, his voice shaking with impotent rage. "No," Boaz said, his voice calm and steady as the mountain behind him. "You already do." The rain swallowed them as they retreated back down the path, a pack of defeated dogs slinking away into the night. Marin stood in the rain, the cold water washing over her, but she didn't feel it. She was looking at Boaz. He hadn't fought them with his fists or his weapons. He had fought them with his will, and he had won. Something had shifted between them. The quiet understanding had deepened, solidified into something else. Trust. The kind of trust that isn't built in safety, but forged in a storm when you choose to stand next to someone, knowing the whole world is against you. And high above them, the mountain seemed to let out a long, slow breath, as if it, too, understood that something important had just been decided. The war wasn't over, but the first battle had been won. Dawn broke not with light, but with a slow, reluctant graying of the sky. A fresh layer of snow had fallen overnight, muffling the world in a blanket of white. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before the final, desperate charge. Marin stood at the edge of the clearing, barefoot in the snow. The cold seeped into her skin, but she didn't feel it. In her hands, she held a long, curved horn, polished smooth from years of use. It was Boaz's. He used it to signal when he was lost in a storm, or when he'd brought down a deer far from the cabin. It was a sound the mountain knew, She saw them coming before she heard them. 4 dark figures on a horseback, moving slowly up the path. Jeb was in the lead, his face a mask of cold fury. Ezek was beside him, his arm in a makeshift sling. The other 2 were Benker and Luke Hensley, men who weren't evil, just weak. The kind of men who follow a bully because they're too afraid not to. They dismounted at the edge of the clearing, their movements cautious. They scanned the cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, a thin, steady stream. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. An invitation, or a trap. "Stay sharp," Jeb barked, his voice a harsh rasp in the silence. "He's in there somewhere." Ezek grinned, a broken, ugly thing. "Maybe he's still sleeping. Let's go wake him up." "Shut your mouth," Jeb hissed. Then Marin stepped out from behind the trees. The 4 men froze. Jeb's jaw went slack. She stood there, a pale, ghost-like figure in her old, mended shawl, her bare feet stark against the white snow. One hand held the horn, the other hung loose at her side. "You're not supposed to be here," Jeb stammered, his bravado gone. "I hadn't finished praying," she said, her voice soft, but carrying in the still air. Ezek lifted his rifle, his eyes wide with fear. "It's a trick! She's bait!" He was right. She lifted the horn to her lips and blew. It wasn't a loud sound. It didn't need to be. It was deep and resonant, a call that echoed off the trees and rolled down the mountainside. It wasn't a sound of distress. It was a sound of warning, a promise. And then the woods exploded. He came from the trees, not from the cabin. He moved without a sound, a phantom of vengeance emerging from the winter landscape. Boaz. In his right hand, he carried his wood-splitting axe. In his left, a long-bladed hunting knife. His face was devoid of all emotion. His eyes were flat, cold, and ancient, the eyes of a predator. Benker turned white as the snow. "Hell no," he whispered and tried to run. He didn't get 2 steps. Boaz was on him in a flash, a blur of motion. It wasn't a fight. It was a storm. A single, brutal blow from the flat of the axe sent the boy crumpling to his knees, the air driven from his lungs. Boaz didn't even look down at him. He was already moving toward the others. Jeb swung his rifle like a club. "You savage bastard!" he screamed. Boaz batted the rifle aside with his forearm as if it were a twig. The butt of his axe came around in a short, vicious arc and connected with Jeb's wrist. There was a sickening crack, like a dry branch snapping. Jeb shrieked, a high, thin sound, and his rifle fell uselessly into the snow. Ezek, seeing his brother go down, lunged forward with a knife of his own. The blade sliced through Boaz's coat, biting into his shoulder, but it barely went an inch deep before Boaz's hand shot out and clamped around Ezek's wrist. Then came the silence, a terrible, focused silence. Boaz looked directly into Ezek's eyes, and then, slowly, deliberately, he began to twist. Ezek's wrist bent backward at an unnatural angle, the bones grinding together. There was a wet popping sound. Ezek howled, a raw, animal sound of pure agony. "That's one," Boaz said, his voice calm. He drove his knee up, hard, into Ezek's already bruised ribs. Once, twice. "That's 2. He shoved Ezek to the ground and leaned in close, whispering something in his ear. Something that made the blood drain from Ezek's face, leaving him shaking and whimpering in the snow. Jeb was trying to crawl away, dragging his broken hand behind him. Boaz ignored him. He walked past the 2 broken brothers, past the whimpering grocer's son, and stopped in front of Marin. He looked at the shallow cut on his shoulder, then back at her. "You ready?" he asked, his voice gentle. She looked down at her left hand, at the thin gold band on her ring finger, the ring Jeb had put there, a symbol of ownership, a brand. Her voice when she spoke was as cold and clear as the winter air. "Take it off me." Boaz knelt in the snow. His large, rough fingers were surprisingly delicate as he worked the ring off her finger, careful not to touch her skin. He held the small gold band between his thumb and forefinger for a moment, then he pressed it deep into the snow, bearing it under his palm until it was gone. Marin stared at the spot where the ring had vanished. "It's done," she said. "No, ma'am," Boaz murmured, his eyes still on the ground. "It's just begun." He rose to his feet, grabbed Jeb and Izek by their collars and hauled them upright. He tied their hands with a piece of coarse rope he pulled from his coat. Neither of them resisted. They were broken, beaten, not just their bodies but their pride, their rage, the ugly thing that had driven them for so long. It was gone. Boaz looked down the path, toward the town that was hidden in the morning mist. "Marin," he said. She nodded. Side by side, they started walking down the mountain. They left the other two men where they lay in the snow. They would find their own way back, or they wouldn't. The mountain didn't care. Elhorn Hollow was just waking up when they arrived. Folks were on their way to church, their faces scrubbed clean, their best clothes on. Miss Hollis was standing on the church steps, arranging her shawl, ready to deliver another sermon on the sins of others. And then they saw them. The whole town stopped. A wave of silence washed over the street. Boaz Danner, the mountain devil, walking into town as if he owned it. And Marin Holt, the broken woman, walking beside him, her head held high. And behind them, stumbling and bleeding, tied together like cattle, were Jeb and Ezek Holt. The sheriff was the first to move. He stepped out of his office, his face pale, his hand hovering near the pistol on his hip. Boaz didn't even look at him. He untied the rope and let the Holt brothers collapse in a heap in the muddy street. "These men," Boaz said, his voice booming in the silence, "broke a woman's bones and called it their right." The crowd shifted, murmuring. "They did it smiling," Marin added, her voice ringing with a strength no one had ever heard from her before. "They laughed while I bled. And all of you," she said, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the townspeople, "you all looked away." No one met her eyes. "She ran off with him!" Miss Hollis screeched from the church steps, pointing a trembling finger. "She's a sinner!" Boaz turned his head and looked at her. Just looked. His eyes were flat and hard, and under his gaze Miss Hollis shrank back, her words dying in her throat. "You just prayed louder when you heard her scream," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He turned back to the sheriff. "There are laws against what they did," he said. "Are you going to enforce them, or does the mountain have to keep them?" It was a threat, cold and clear, justice one way or another. The sheriff looked at his sons, broken and bleeding in the dirt. He looked at the faces of the townspeople, their eyes full of fear and a dawning shame. He looked at Boaz, a man who could not be intimidated. And then he looked at Maureen. He saw the fire in her eyes, the strength in her spine. She was not the same woman he had dismissed from his office months ago. "We'll jail them," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with defeat. Two men, Benker and Luke, emerged from the crowd, their heads hung in shame, and hauled Jeb and Ezek to their feet. They didn't look at Marin as they dragged the brothers toward the jailhouse. Boaz looked down at Marin. "You want to stay here?" She looked at the town, at the general store where no one had ever asked about her bruises, at the church whose doors had always felt closed to her, at the silent, watching windows. "No," she said. They turned and walked back toward the mountain, leaving the town to choke on its own silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the silence of complicity anymore. It was the silence of shame, the silence of reckoning. The next Sunday, Maureen walked into town alone. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't have Boaz beside her. She just walked down the main street, her shoulders back, her head held high. When she reached the church, the doors were open. She didn't go inside. She just stood on the steps for a long moment, then turned and walked away. But she left a small carved wooden hawk on the collection plate just inside the door. It was enough. It was a message. The mountain was still watching. They built a new cabin, higher up the ridge, in a meadow where the morning sun hit first. Boaz built 2 chairs, and they would sit by the fire at night, not speaking, but not needing to. Maureen filled the shelves with books, and sometimes she would read aloud, her voice strong and clear, filling the small space with stories of other worlds. They never spoke of love. The word felt too small for what had grown between them. It was something quieter, stronger. It was in the way he tended the small garden she had planted, his large hands gentle with the new green shoots. It was in the way she mended his coat when the seams gave way, her stitches small and neat. When the storms came now, they sat side by side and listened to the wind, not with fear, but with a shared understanding. Some storms don't come to destroy you. They come to clear the path. For anyone out there who's been made to feel small, who's been told to be quiet, who's been broken and bent until you thought you would snap, remember the story of Maren Holt. Remember that there's a kind of strength that doesn't shout. It grows in the silence, like a fire smoldering under the snow. And when it finally breaks through, it doesn't come for revenge. It comes for justice. It comes for peace. If you enjoyed this story, do us a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments below, let us know. What do you think Boaz whispered in Ezek's ear? We read every single one. Thanks for listening.